In this video, we're going to discuss a little bit about events and event handlers, how they're used, how we need them for our commands, and some of the different types. So if we go to regular Fusion 360 here, we've seen that in my previous videos, we've created some commands, some command definitions to put two buttons into my toolbar. Now we need to notify Fusion 360 whenever these buttons are pressed. So if a user comes and presses this button, Fusion 360 needs to know that that happened, and then it can do something. And then also here, if a user presses OK, Fusion 360 needs to know that that happens, and then it needs to know what to do following that. And that you do that through events and handlers. So let's go ahead and go to the help page and read a little about events and handlers. So here in the user's manual, under events, there's a whole page on events. It would be very beneficial to read through that. So here it says, events are the ability for you to receive notifications when certain actions occur within Fusion. And then it also says to implement an event, you need to add a handler function to your code and connect that handler to the event. So basically, with those buttons, we're going to connect a handler and an event to those buttons. So as soon as those buttons are pressed, an event is triggered, and it needs to be handled through a handler. So let's look at their pseudocode here. I'm going to zoom in. So here at the very beginning of our code, we're going to have a global variable called handlers. And then we're also going to create a whole new class that's going to be an event handler. And there's going to be several different types. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. But we're going to create a class. We can name it whatever we want. And then we need this snippet of code. And depending on what type of event handler, we have different ones here. These 3 lines of code will be needed as well. We won't go into depth about that. But then you can have any code that you want here that basically any code that you want to be ran once that button is pressed or once that event is triggered. And then also in your main code, wherever you created your command, you defined your command, you need to be able to link this into that command and then also have that be handled. So first of all, we're going to create a variable that links it to this class that you created. So here we have the myExecuteHandler class, and we're just going to link that and call it onExecute. So first of all, you're going to link it with that button. So whatever button you created or whatever you called it, or that command. So you have your command variable .execute, and this will actually be different depending on the type of event that you have. But .execute.add, and then you'll just throw in your event class. You also need a handler for that, so you just do handlers.append, and then whatever class that is as well. So let's go ahead and look at my code and see how I did that. So first of all, from the beginning of my code, we have our handlers here, and I actually created 4 events. So this is my first. If my belt button is pressed, I have an event handler for that, and it's just a command created event handler. It's just the very initialization. If that button is pressed, we use the command created event handler. And then all of this is my code that we will discuss in a later video about all of the inputs, but this is the code that is ran as soon as that button is pressed. Now notice my next class is also just a button pressed event handler if for my other button, the pulley button. Also remember I use just the command created event handler. Now these other ones are a little bit different. So I have a pulley dialog OK event handler is what I called it. Basically this is the event that occurs if within the dialog box, if they have this, if they hit the OK button, I have an event for that, and it tells Fusion 360 what to do after that OK button has been pressed. So this is a little bit different. Up here we had command created event handler, so that's just the very beginning if that button was pressed. But we have a command event handler if the OK button is pressed. So that's a different one. And then the 4th class here, I also have an input changed handler. So if different things are constantly changing within that dialog box, it's a different event. So I just have an input changed event handler. Let me show you what that would be in Fusion 360. So this is my other button. Notice I don't even need an OK here, but if they change these, I'm sending events and triggers to Fusion 360 every time something is changed in this, and so that is going to be called an input changed event handler. So I have 4 different events. So now let's go down into my regular code down at the bottom here. And we've talked about this in the previous video. I have two buttons, remember. I have two commands. I used command definitions. My first command is my belt button. And all of this code here just sets up my belt button definition. We've talked about that in the previous video. And all of this code here just talks about my pulley button and defining that. So this is the code that is the event handler. So notice I have my belt button pressed event handler. This class, I just rename it belt button pressed. Then I link this with my belt button definition. So I have my belt button definition dot command created. Notice that was a little bit different than we saw the pseudocode online. But this is for a brand new command created. So we'll do belt button definition dot command created dot add, and I'm going to add in this class. Also notice that I add it to the handlers just by doing handlers.append belt button pressed, so this class. The same thing for the pulley button. Right here I have a pulley button pressed. I just name that and link it to the class, to the pulley button pressed event handler. And I have my pulley button definition, and I pass this into that. So I do command created.add pulley button pressed, and then handlers.append pulley button pressed. So that's kind of a quick overview of events and event handlers. We've created these classes to run code, and this is basically going to be triggered as soon as a user clicks that button, since we linked it with a certain button, and then we also linked it with the handler. So once again, I would recommend coming in and reading, if you have any more questions, coming to this page and reading about events. And the next video is going to be about some of that code that you put in inside of the event handler.